What do leaders not get about remote and hybrid work, and how would you go about designing or redesigning a team for success? Well, hello and welcome to Redesign Your Long Distance Team. My name is Roger Courville, and welcome to another episode of V2's Thought Leader Conversation series. And today's conversation is brought to you by, Virtual Venues, the team with a whole lot of experience bringing you virtual and hybrid event production. But today is not about us. It's about you and bringing you another sharp thinker that we would be honored to have you pay forward if you like what Wayne's got to say. And I'm excited to welcome to the virtual stage somebody that I've not talked to in so long, I can't even remember that far back. But I know he started an organization eons back called Great Web Meetings, and that was a long time ago. So welcome to the virtual stage, coach and master trainer at the Kevin Eikenberry Group. Almost 20 years in virtual work and communication, author of 15 books, including The Long Distance Leader and what we're here to talk about today. The latest one coming out February 28th, The Long Distance Team, Designing Your Team for Everyone's Success. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you, Roger. How are you, man?
I'm so glad that you just took a moment to just, have a conversation for the crew that might be listening in. Fill in a couple gaps. Tell us who you are and what you're up to lately.
Who am I? My name is Wayne Turmel. I have been in the training development space since 1996 and focusing on remote and virtual communication. Boy,
you're one of the legit
I want to
old-timers.
say at least 2001, 2002. I mean, you and I were very early to this space. I mean, we originally met each other when everybody in it could be in one cab.
Right.
Pretty much. And so I went off on my own. I started greatwebmeetings.com. And then a few years ago, 7 or so, Kevin Eikenberry, who a lot of people know, and was a colleague and friend of mine for a long time, we were having a conversation and he was getting all of these requests. He does wonderful work around leadership. He was getting a lot of requests about remote teams and remote work. And my specialty was remote work and remote communication. And I was getting requests about leadership management stuff. And rather than invent two separate wheels, we just smushed our companies together. Created the Remote Leadership Institute. That's now been folded in. He bought my company and folded it into the Kevin Eikenberry Group. And so that's it. And we wrote Long Distance Leader in 2018. And then Long Distance Teammate in 2020. We literally finished the first draft 2 weeks before the COVID shutdown, which timing is always interesting.
Right.
and now, just in time as people are returning to work, we're taking a look at the long distance team. And so that's what we do. And I live in Las Vegas and, try to stay out of trouble.
By the way, folks, smushed is an official MBA business school kind of term. So you heard it here first. I actually appreciated that one of the things that you said in your book was that you didn't write this just as a response to COVID. There's a bigger picture here. But even before we get there, I'm leaning forward a little bit. Just out of curiosity, why are you so fascinated with how people communicate online?
Well, I'm actually fascinated by how people communicate or don't at work. You got time for a story that has nothing to do with remote and everything to do why I'm here?
We're here to talk about interesting things, and you're an interesting person, so let her rip.
Third grade, I'm 8 years old, and our class is doing the dinosaur diorama, right? Everybody has done the dinosaur diorama with the shoebox with little plastic dinosaurs, and we're doing it as a team project. So poor Janice Levy is diligently gluing dinosaurs and palm trees, and I'm the redheaded hyper kid, and I'm bouncing off the walls and being no help. But the teacher says, we need somebody to talk about your project. And I go, oh, I get to have everybody look at me and not get in trouble for it? Ooh, sign me up. So I get up and I do my little thing. This is a brontosaurus. This is a T-Rex. Thunderous applause. As I'm going back to my chair, I hear the teacher say, "Let's hear it again for Wayne's group." And I went, huh. I did literally the least of anything. But because I was the one who communicated our idea to the group, I became the face of that group. And I realized at the age of 8 that people judge you and you will get opportunities or be held back largely based on how well you communicate. And so, forward, I graduate high school. I spend 18 years as a stand up comic, uh, traveling, moving from Canada to the States, all of that good stuff. And the time comes I have to run away from the circus and get a day job. Well, I have one marketable skill. I can stand there and talk. So I started working for a company that did, among other things, presentation skills. And I did that for a number of years and was pretty darn good at it. And I remember the conversation distinctly. I was having a conversation with somebody. This is, oh Lord, 2005, 2006. And they said, this presentation stand at the front of the room stuff is great, but I only talk to real people like twice a year. The rest of the time, there's this thing called WebEx. And I realized, just as you did, that nobody was teaching anybody how to use it. It's like, here's your WebEx license, try not to hurt somebody.
Yep.
And I realized
email from IT that says, here's your login. Login for what? Why?
Well, exactly. And not only do most people suck at communicating anyway, now we've put this technological barrier in front of people. And the problem, as you well know, and it hasn't gotten that much better, is 80% of people use 20% of the features of these tools. And ironically, my experience was people who were really good presenters struggled the most with making the shift to working online.
Yep. And sometimes senior execs, because they thought, I already know how to pull off a room. I don't need to figure out a different way to do it.
But the things that allowed us to dominate a room, picking up the subtle signals from the audience, there's a feedback loop that is constant when you're standing in front of people. When you are working electronically, this is me literally preaching to the choir. But when you work remotely, you are not getting that feedback that you're used to. You're also not, and this is the problem, right? 75% of people are afraid of public speaking. The other 25 are needy people like me who get off on it. And what we get off on is the feedback, the laughter, the energy. And you don't get that in the same way.
Right.
When you present online.
Though,
and nobody was telling anybody that.
I know. And I think this is why you were kind of a long time ago a brother from another mother. Because when I first got into this, of course, I started looking for books, and of course there are no books. In fact, I wrote one of the very first books ever on the space. But what I figured out real early on, and you did too, was that at the end of the day, this is about people connecting with people. It just happens to be through a tool. And I'm like, if I had a nickel for every time I heard, somebody say, well, but you can't see your audience or whatever the argument is. I'm like, yeah, so you can't see somebody when you're on the telephone, right? So you never use the telephone. No, it has a place. and we still.
It was also really interesting because as people started to deliver training this way, right? The bean counters went crazy. This is great. Oh my gosh, we don't have to put people on planes and we don't have to book hotel rooms and we love this.
Well, that's what got us acquired by Microsoft. They were spending $1 billion a year on travel, and they bought our little company for $50 million, in 2000. And they're like, or 200 million, but they're like, hey, if we save 1 out of 5 trips, we've paid for you in a year. I'm like, well, that's a pretty good investment.
Well, and I would talk to people and they'd say, well, training doesn't work. Well, what do you do? Well, we do webinars, we do this, we do that. I go, if you walked into a classroom and you said to the audience, I'm going to talk for 45 minutes. I don't want you to ask questions. I don't want you to respond. Frankly, I don't even care if you look at me. And in 45 minutes, I'll take your questions. How effective would that class be? And everybody laughs and they go, it would be a car wreck and we'd all be sleeping. Yeah, so why are you doing that to your audience? So, what I did, which was very similar to your approach, is what do we know about how people communicate? And how do we make the adjustment? Now, fast forward to I'm working with Kevin on the long distance leader. And the first question, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure out why does this feel so different? And what we realized at the end of the day, and there's a model in the long distance leader, please, I encourage you to go look at it. But basically, we broke it down to these rules for being a good remote leader. And rule number one is think leadership first, location second.
I love that.
Our experience, and probably the experience of everybody listening, is if you're a really good leader and you do what really good leaders do, you've found a way to muddle through COVID and working remotely and all of that stuff. If you're a lousy leader, you've probably struggled and your people have struggled as a result.
Right.
You know, I know you've heard me say a dozen times, we've always had remote teams. Genghis Khan ruled half the world and never held a Zoom meeting. You know, Julius Caesar did great out in the field. It's when he came back to the office, things kind of went pear-shaped. So it can be done. It's always been done. People have always found a way to make it work. What we've tried to do is just say, stop, breathe. Let's look at what's going on. Do you understand the dynamics? Then you can take what you already know about being a good leader or develop the skills that you need to be a good leader and make it easier on yourself and your team.
And, I'm going to go back to something you said, I don't know, a few minutes ago. But one of the things, I don't remember where I saw the stat, but it was basically an analysis of the difference between leaders and non-leaders. And it really came down to communication, right? At some point, growth upward in an organization wasn't about having greater or better technical knowledge. It was about the ability to communicate and otherwise, connect, communicate, coordinate. And that's actually why I love this latest book and why I'm glad you've had it. You've taken a moment to come share.
Well, thank you. The Financial Times of London did a study years ago, and they do it periodically. They kind of renew it. But the top numbers don't change. What is the number one factor in somebody's promotability? And it's not how good are you at your job. It's not how many lines of code can you write. It's not any of those things. It's how well can you communicate. I remember I was working with a client in Silicon Valley, and they had a problem because they kept promoting people to manager, and then 6 months later, they were back on the bench and they couldn't keep frontline managers. And I remember saying to this person, I don't get it. You get prestige, you get the title, you get more money, you're further along in your career. And he looked at me with all the innocence of a 6-year-old and says, yeah, but code does what you tell it to do the first time, and you don't have to ask how the kids are.
Right.
And we know that. We see that always. I mean, what do people do? They get promoted based on their expertise at whatever they do. I mean, the biggest mistake organizations make is they take their best salesperson and they make them the sales manager.
Yep.
Well, not only are you taking your best salesperson out of the field and reducing your revenue, but what are the things that make somebody your best salesperson? They don't take no for an answer. They're super. Now, start comparing the skills that make somebody your best salesperson and the person that makes a good manager. I'm guessing that Venn diagram is not as nice and fat as we would like it to be.
I think it's not as I agree. In my own experience, one of the best sales managers we had Placeware and Microsoft couldn't sell his way out of a paper bag, and yet he always had this awesome team, which might even be a good transition to talking about your latest book here.
I
And
love a
I
good
grew
segue, man.
I I grew to really appreciate what he did and how he did it because he knew how to get people to want to perform. He had the respect, and they knew that he would go to bat for them if they needed a problem solved, and he used his position in the organization to go figure out how to go make something happen. But the truth was he couldn't sell his way out of a paper bag. I know, because I was on a team once with him a lot of years ago, and we missed quota because of him, not me. But
But that gets to the heart of what's the difference between a manager and a leader, right? A manager crunches the numbers, manages to the metrics, is all about getting compliance and administering the thing, as opposed to a leader who is setting a vision and then helping people, inspiring them to want to achieve it, getting rid of the roadblocks so that they can achieve it, and supporting and reinforcing the right behaviors. Technically, they're the same job, but they're very different mindsets.
exactly, exactly, another Venn diagram that doesn't overlap probably as much as some people think.
Exactly.
Thinking about teams.
Yeah.
Your book is about team design, and then later on in the book, you address redesign. And I loved that transition in part because I'm guessing plenty of folks are going, yeah, okay, but what do I do? I've already got a team. There's already a structure here. But let's start at the beginning. You say team design is about framework, structure, and format. Tell us where you're going with that.
Well, we did a lot of thinking about how do we organize these thoughts, right? Because whether you are starting a team from scratch or you're starting a team, you've got a team that already exists, you have to think about, what do I want this team to look like? Right? What is the framework? What is this going to look like? Then how is the team going to function? What's the work that needs to be done? What are all the moving parts? How do we make sure that all of those parts um, are met so that work comes out the other end of the grinder? And then, how do we do that in a way that creates a workplace that we want to live and work in? And that's true whether you're designing or redesigning. It's a whole lot easier to build a boat from scratch than it is to fix the boat
Right.
when it's in the water. So what we
But it's
decided,
useful to know what that boat should look like, even if you are fixing one that's already in the water.
that's exactly it. We said, well, why don't we start with, in a perfect world, right? In a perfect world, if there was nothing that you had to fix or change, right? You were building this from scratch. What are the things you need to think about? What are the steps? How do you involve people in creating that, right? Well, okay, that's in a perfect world. Now your boat's already in the water. It's the same process, and it's more complicated. People are invested. People are, it's easier to create a culture from scratch than it is to change an existing culture. And it's funny, our publisher, you'll notice on the cover, long distance team, designing your team for everyone's success. We do not use the C word on the cover. That was our publisher's decision. Nobody buys books about culture. But what is culture? Culture is a $10 HR word for, this is how we do it here.
Right.
So an aspirational culture is, how do we want to do it here? How do we want to, in the book, I mean, the big central kind of idea is that whether you're starting from scratch or fixing your team, there are what we call the three C's of culture, which are communication, collaboration, cohesion. If you think about your team, how are we going to communicate with each other? How are we going to work together to get the work done? And how do we form relationships? And what are the rules for getting along and working? And we know some teams are all about no conflict. For the love of God, don't argue with anybody, don't rock the boat, don't,
Right.
right? Well, that's not a great way to do great work.
Yeah. And
You, you
it's,
avoid you avoid discomfort sometimes.
I forget the aphorism, I don't know X, but I don't know how to define X, but I know it when I see it. And I would love to come back to that, because one of the chapters that you had was about establishing ownership of culture, and being the leader in terms of the progenitor of how do we get where we need to go. But it resonated with me the way that you put that, in part because a rare moment of tooting our horn. One of the beautiful things that I experience here, technically V2 has an office, but only a third of people go into the office and everybody else works remotely, and we got people all over the country. So it's functionally a remote company, but all day in Slack, they're taking care of each other's back. Everybody's got everybody's back, right? If somebody's sick, if somebody literally just had a death in the family, whatever it is, hey, I got to run to the dentist. Can somebody cover the support line for me, or whatever? And it's like, bam, you don't even have to question. It's not begging someone to take your responsibility for the afternoon. This crew runs like money. And I'm just like, this is a beautiful thing. And I've known this crew for a long time, so I was pretty tickled to join them. But I'm curious.
Well, it's interesting what you just said there, because this is obviously this was going on for a while, right? And this is not just the last 6 months or whatever. You guys have figured this out and made it work, and people have figured it out and made it work for a long time. What's happened, and a lot of the people who are listening to this, I suspect, are dealing with this. There was a plan for remote work. The world was changing. It was shifting way more than anybody wanted to admit it was shifting. There was a lot of stealth remote work going on, and everybody had a plan. In 6 months, we're going to have a remote work policy in place. And then COVID came and pushed
Because
everybody.
policies really change a lot of things.
Yeah, exactly. And COVID came and pushed everybody across the Rubicon, and there was this mad scramble to make it work. And to the surprise of senior leaders everywhere, darned if we didn't make it work.
They're still cleaning out
Nobody
their
said it
undies
was
from that
easy.
one.
Well, it's interesting because now we are at a point. There are very few times in life when there is a defined moment
Right.
where you can make decisions. And we're at that point. As we come out of COVID and we think about return to office, this is an inflection point. We have some choices to make right now. Some companies, Chase, and some others, Jamie Dimon and Iger at Disney and some others have said, no, COVID is over, which is probably news to those who have it. COVID is over. Get your butts back into the office. We're reverting to the before times. And they're shocked to discover that there is resistance and people aren't exactly swallowing that. There are organizations who are struggling putting a return to office plan together because they had a policy. They figured out, top leaders sat down and said, this is what it's going to look like. And it didn't look like that
Right.
in the real world. We have, and this isn't in the book because Kevin came up with this phrase after somebody hit print, but we have this thing we call pilot before policy. Because the one thing we learned is there are too many moving parts to organizing a team and restructuring it. And if you assume that things are going to go a certain way and they don't, then it's like, oh my gosh, what do we do? If you go in thinking, okay, let's take the next 6 months, figure out what this looks like, keep what works, tweak what doesn't, it's far less painful. But the biggest change that people are making, and it's not always voluntary, it's not always conscious, is that it used to be there were fully intact teams or you had people working remotely. But the time that the team worked, the kind of structure around it, it was like everybody's in the office, but some of them are on webcam. Right? Everything was done synchronously. This is why we're in meeting hell from day till night, is because everybody's trying to recreate that office synchronous, lean across the desk and ask the person next to you environment. What we are in now is a time when hybrid work is in, and hybrid is not just some people are in the office and some people are not. Hybrid is just like when you take a horse and a donkey and you create a mule is its own animal. It has features of donkeys and horses, but it is its own thing.
Right.
And that's where we're at with hybrid teams. Hybrid teams cannot function on a purely synchronous system. If you've got people working from home, they're going to start figuring out, I'm better in the morning, or I need at noon, I've got to pick the kids up from daycare, I got to do blah, 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 but I can get really good work done at night after they go to bed, right? And that's not working more hours, it's just partitioning up their workload. You can bring people in from other time zones. The ability to hire people globally changes, but you can't ask the person in Singapore to be there for your 9 a.m. team huddle.
Side note, when we started CoreVent, we left Microsoft and got a couple $1 million of angel money and started CoreVent, and part of the company was virtual event production. Part of it was consulting and driving adoption. And at that time, I was far enough back, there was a lot of adoption going on in like big telcos and or being driven by big telcos. And the number one thing that we found on whether or not something would stick, right? Because this was still new enough. There were plenty of companies, like we joked at the very beginning, you get okay, we now have live meeting or whatever it is, and they'd send out an email and now everybody's got this login. But behavior didn't change.
Right.
And part of that process of leading change we identified was whether or not the person who was leading, and that could be at a super senior level, or it could just be this team and saying, how do we do this amongst ourselves? And this is before Slack and Teams and the asynchronous and synchronous came together. They're so much closer now, like with Slack and Teams or chat.
We're running out of excuses for not doing it. I'm just saying.
Right. But at the end of the day, that everybody's got to be in the office was because I don't want to change how I lead and manage, as opposed to what's just started happening, which was at some level, there was some groundswell because a team would figure it out. And then other people would start going, oh, how are you doing that? And it was actually, to your point about culture, and I want to come back to that. At some point, the leadership behaviorally was saying, hey, we can do this. And one of the things, and I'm sure you observed this too, but I've seen this because I've done lots of consulting around meetings, not just events. And one of my arguments for a long time was that it's actually easier to be all remote than hybrid. And people would be like, oh my gosh, what are you saying? And I'm like, because now everybody's co-equal. We all transfer documents the same way. We all, show something. But I said, how many of you, and this was the rhetorical question, how many of you have gone into a conference room and you let two people, come in with whatever platform you're using, and they sit there like a bump on a log, and then next is somebody in the room goes, oh, Wayne, you got anything to say? And you take yourself off of mute and go, nope, I'm good. Right. And it was just, when everybody was co-equal, we figured out together how to blend that synchronous and asynchronous, right? Whether it is a document transfer or use of chat to privately say something like behind the scenes when we're remote, as opposed to like when we're in the office and I can lean over to you and whisper to you. And so that culture was, some people figured it out and some people didn't. And interestingly, at least one of the studies that I did actually found that was not just a generational thing. Commonly it was foisted upon, well, that's the young kids who just want a text
They
message.
know technology, they're digital natives.
Right.
Those darn kids with their rock and roll and their texting. Yes.
So come back to your 3 C's in culture, and that idea of how did you put it? Establishing ownership of the culture. Whether somebody's at the top or just going to be a leader, how do you establish ownership of the culture?
Well, ownership is like engagement. You can't tell people, "Congratulations, you now own this." It's like
Yeah.
it's like telling people, "Great, you're engaged now." Well, no.
Yeah.
I mean, think about this in very simple semantic terms. If I'm in a
It's like
relationship,
voluntold. You're
well,
going to do it and
yeah,
you're going to love
exactly.
it.
But it's like engagement, which is what drives ownership. So this is relevant. If I'm in a relationship, I can take you out. We can have a great time together. We can make plans. I can buy the ring. I can get on one knee. I can ask you to marry me. You are not engaged until you say you are. Right?
Right.
Same thing with ownership. Ownership isn't something you can, responsibility can be thrust upon you,
Right.
but ownership cannot. And what does that mean? It means people have to, before they can do anything, they have to buy into the change that's happening. Very rarely can that be imposed. People have to be engaged from the beginning. It needs to be part of the conversation. And you're always going to have those people who are super, super into it, and those people who are going to resist just for the sake of resisting, and most people in the middle who are like, fine, whatever, because that's how human beings operate. But you have to give people the chance to buy in. They need to understand. One of the things about training is that there are 3 reasons people don't behave the way you want them to behave. Right? The first is, do they know what they're supposed to do? Is it,
Right.
do they know they're supposed to do this and not this? Sometimes it's just a matter of telling them, right? We need you to do this. Oh, okay. The second is, do they have the skills to do it? So we're going to work from home now. Okay, how do I, remember 80% of people use 20% of the features of tools like Teams. There's probably tons of ways to make my life easier, but I'm using all these workarounds and doing it the way I did it in the office. So maybe if you taught me the skills necessary to do this, it's not as awkward and painful as weird as I thought it was going to be. And so great, I'm on board. But the biggest reason people don't change their behavior is their attitude.
Right.
It was easier to do it the old way. I'm used to doing it the old way. If I do it this new way, I'm going to look like an idiot. I'm 5 years from retirement. I've seen this movie.
I've heard that literally. I've heard that literally.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I'm retiring in a couple of years. Not changing.
Yeah. And by the way, why should they? I mean, I can push on that person. Now, I can say to that person, you know what? People really respect you. They respect your expertise. I know you're leaving soon, but that doesn't mean your brain has died. This is a challenge. I want to enlist you. You can be a mentor to other people. Oh yeah, okay. And everybody's going to respond differently, but somebody doing it because it's they're told to do it is very different. What you get if it comes from the top down is compliance.
Right.
Compliance is not buy-in. Compliance
trainer
doesn't get you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, you're totally right. I was going to put a big exclamation point behind something that what you just said, because you just said, well, there's three reasons: awareness, skill, attitude.
Right.
If I'm catching
Knowledge, skill, attitude.
knowledge, skill, attitude. Um, but as a fellow person with more decades of training experience than I can count, we get to know all of the frequently asked questions, and one of the frequently asked questions, since I've done lots of training the trainer for ATD and around the world, is, well, how do you motivate people? And often I'm getting that question after I've made the point, because I usually do, that the key element in adult learning is motivation. And people are like, well, how do you motivate people? How do you get people to do what you don't want to, how do you get people to do that? And I'm like, think about it. People go to war and die for a mission, like willingly.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do we help someone tap into meaning and purpose and understanding what they're contributing, and go read some Dan Pink or whatever? But if you think it's just about the knowledge, then you're still going to fall short, because they're going to go back to the desk the next day. And to your point, just keep doing it the way I've always been doing it, because I know it. And frankly, I don't want to try something new, because I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to make a mistake or whatever. And
Leading people through a change becomes a lot easier, and this is an incredibly cynical way to put it, and my tongue is firmly in my cheek.
bring it. We're just in the keeping it
Leadership
real
is
mode
a
here.
whole lot easier when you realize that people are essentially selfish and lazy. That I realized the chill that just went through the airwaves as we wrote that. But the fact of the matter is, right? People will march through hell if they want to go, if they see the reason, if they're motivated.
Right.
People will put in discretionary effort if they care about the work, if they care about their coworkers, if they care about their customers, if they're engaged. You get discretionary effort. People, one of the things when COVID hit that surprised the heck out of senior leaders, and they won't admit this, but it's true, the big concern was, how do we know that people are working? And how do we know they won't just slack off? Well, in fact, a couple of interesting things happened in the first March to July of when COVID hit. Employee engagement scores shot way up. Why? Well, we're in a crisis, right?
Get to rally
Let's
around the
pull
flag.
together.
Yep.
Rally around the flag. I don't want to let my teammates down. The problem was not people not working. The problem was people didn't know how to not work. They were checking their email the minute they
Right.
got up in the morning. They were sending their last emails at 10:30 at night. They were home, but they weren't present at dinner or for their family, because there was a call, there was this or there was that. One of the big things after the first wave of remote work was teaching people how to manage their time better and disconnect, because people were engaged. Now, some of that engagement was fear and self-interest. I don't want to lose my job. I'm going to prove to my boss I'm working, like that. But a lot of it was that rally round the flag. Senior leaders were stunned that that was people's attitude, because that's not what they expected at all.
Right. When I'm being snarky, my turn. When I'm being snarky answering that question, I'm like, well, how do we know people are working? I don't know. The same way you should have been doing it when everybody was in the office, managing to metrics, as opposed, what are you responsible to get done? And do I hold you accountable for that? As opposed to, I spent X number of hours on the computer.
Yeah. Somebody shows up on time and doesn't leave early. Does that mean they are productive or a good worker? You know, and I know that that is a indicator, but it is not proof, and it is not a metric.
Right.
So we have to look at, how are we measuring output? How are we measuring productivity? all of that good stuff. And so when we're designing a team, that's what we need to think about, right? Does it really matter that when I have a question at 9:05 Eastern time and I send it out on Teams, everybody on the team can respond and is expected to respond at that time?
Right.
You know?
Believe me, trust me. When I was at Microsoft, the division that I was in, there was kind of an unspoken contest for who could send the first email in the morning or who could send the last one at night.
It's so crazy that you say that. When I was still in LA and my friend slash boss had moved to New York, we got into this weird alpha male contest about who could send emails at the weirdest time of the night. And we'd egg each, hey, you sent that at 2 in the morning. It must be nice not to have to sleep. It was insane. That's no way to function. And so he and I actually had to create a pact where we said we will send emails between this hour and there is no expectation that you will respond
Right.
until your day begins. Now, I wonder if this is your experience. My experience, having lived on the West Coast, moved back east, and now back on the West Coast, is that people on the West Coast, generally speaking, are early birds. We have been conditioned to be because the sun
Right.
revolves around the Statue of Liberty, and we need to be functional for New York time.
Except in the Silicon Valley.
Except in Silicon Valley. Because there you're worried about what's going on in India.
Right.
But we're kind of like 7 o'clock in the morning is not a problem, right? That's a 10 a.m. call Eastern. My day always starts by 7 o'clock. But you know what that means? Don't bug me after 2:30 or 3 o'clock.
Right.
I'm done. I'm off the clock. My day's over. Go away. And people on the West Coast understand that kind of intrinsically. First time I went to a meeting in New York and I was in our company's headquarters and I got there at like 7:30, quarter to 8 in the morning and couldn't get into the building because nobody showed up before 9 o'clock. It was like 9 o'clock, day's half gone.
Right.
What the heck?
That's exactly how I felt. What? Oh, yeah. New York Stock Exchange doesn't open until 9 a.m.
So
I'm used to being there for the 6 a.m. bell.
but it's that culture. And if you have a company that's headquartered on the East Coast, odds are that even during COVID, the world worked on home office time.
Yeah. Which interestingly is part of, I think, what has helped the world catch up to what we were talking about earlier, which, to be fair, some laggards are just got here because they were forced to, and now all of a sudden had an aha moment that synchronous and asynchronous have their place, right? There's a time we don't need asynchronous communication. There's a time when we do synchronous communication when we don't honestly need to be on video. Or, right? So we start to, a favorite phrase of mine is optimization drives valuation. And we start to understand where something uniquely fits in the panoply of options. And each one has its place that is irreplaceable and it's best, right? There is a time when Zoom is better than being in person.
Yeah.
There's a time when being in person is better than being on Zoom, but some people were just kind of slow to get there until they were forced to. And I know, go ahead.
Your point is dead on, which is really the difference about hybrid work is that it's the flexibility of time. That's what has to change when we think about how is hybrid work different than all remote or all synchronous.
Oh, yeah, no.
It's about the flexibility of time. Really, let me give you a classic example. Oh, meetings are always better in person because there's. Okay, well, let's assume that that's true. We have all left meetings where we wanted to say something, but you were sitting next to Bob and you know how he is. And if you leave the meeting, and say something against Bob's idea, he's going to be shooting daggers at you the rest of the day, and you don't want to deal with that. So in the meeting, nothing gets said, right? There is some evidence to show that on virtual meetings, people who are usually quiet for social kind of reasons, whether it's fear or politeness or whatever, tend to be more vocal, and it's easier to get information from them.
Mm-hmm.
There are also times you have to have a virtual meeting because you can't get everybody to Portland to have this meeting. It just logistically, financially doesn't make any sense. And so, oh, great. So we can do an in-person meeting or we can do this. Now think about this. Have you ever been in a meeting and you didn't know why you were invited? You didn't know what was going on. So you had no chance to prepare, get yourself together, do some thinking beforehand, come in loaded for the conversation. And then the meeting ends, and you're halfway down the hall, and you go, oh man, you know what I should have said? Or, oh, when he said that, you know what else would be cool? Well, in a synchronous environment, you have the meeting and that's it. In a hybrid environment, you have time to noodle and brainstorm and maybe create an initial list of solutions. And then you have the meeting. And then after the meeting, there's time to process and think and tweak and maybe and come up with a better solution. That's a hybrid solution. When you're working constantly synchronously, you have all the problems that we've always had with meetings. You get groupthink.
We've just gotten more efficient at stacking more of them into the calendar.
Yeah,
exactly. And go from one to one to one to one,
because we don't have to actually physically move from conference room A to conference room B. We can just pile them on top of each other.
Yeah.
So that's we start thinking about, how do we use think time? How do we maximize what happens great synchronously? There is energy. There is
no doubt.
idea building. There is all of that stuff. And there's time for contemplation and thinking and tweaking and coming back and revisiting.
I distinguish between what I think of as formal versus informal. Right. So we're in the meeting. The formal part is Robert's Rules of Order, or somebody's going to make a presentation, or something of that nature. Informal is that I bump into you on the way in and say, how are the kids? Oh, you took the dog to the vet last week, right? And right. And there's that. And honestly, 23 plus years in this business, and people still struggle with that, particularly in event scenarios, though there are platforms like Hopin and WebEx and a number that have finally started building in like virtual networking and that kind of thing. But meeting planners are still missing the fact that one of the most valuable things for why you go to the conference isn't just the content of the keynote or breakout you sit in. It's in the informal part, because when you take that break at 3 p.m. and we're both getting, a cookie that we shouldn't eat and refilling the coffee, I meet you and go, hey, where are you from? And something happens.
Absolutely. Just a couple of really, really simple things. And this isn't really applicable to large events, but it's certainly applicable to meetings. 2 very simple things. One is stop with making people wait in the lobby until the meeting starts.
Shoot me.
What happens when you go to a meeting? You don't stand out in the hallway in front of the door, silently waiting until the door opens and in you go. You come in, you talk to people, you say, oh, Bob, I forgot to get you that thing. Let's do that. How are the kids? Sorry about your Steelers, whatever the thing is, right? There's that informal thing. And that happens when you just let people show up to the meeting.
Right.
There is that conversation. And added bonus, if people are engaged in having those conversations before the meeting starts, it's easier to get them engaged during the meeting. because once they've engaged, the second thing is don't discourage private chat.
Right.
How many times have you been in a meeting?
By
And
the
the
way,
answer
it's
is
going to
every
happen
time.
anyway.
How many times have you been in a meeting and you lean over, and sometimes it's a snarky, smart aleck comment because you and me are you and me, and you lean over and
I've sat there and
well,
traded
that's
text
fine.
messages, like using back in the day MS Messenger or
Right.
something like that. And we'd sit in a meeting in a conference room and chat with each other
But it's
with the person
also
that's
you
across
don't
the table.
you've got a question, and you don't. It's not worth derailing the meeting or taking them off. But did we get that document? Oh yeah, okay, I'll send it to you. Don't discourage that.
Right.
And those are very simple. Those are literally settings on your meeting platform that
Right.
say, do you want people to be able to chat with each other? And do you want them to sit in limbo before the meeting starts? But if you want that dynamic, you can create it fairly simply.
Yeah. I mean, to me, when I work with teams around instructional design or something like that, the very first thing that I always ask is, how would you do this in person?
Right.
Let's take it apart brick by brick, because we have to deconstruct everything brick by brick, because if you leave the frame of the whatever in place, it's going to look like the same building because you just replaced a couple bricks. Take it apart. How
Not
does somebody walk on stage? How do you handle handouts? How do you handle informal versus informal, communication and those kinds of things? Now let's map it and adapt it to wherever we're at. Now, we may or may not get that specific with like a virtual meeting, but to your point, how do people think about, how do people walk there? How do they join the meeting? What happens if the conference room is full and everybody's got to hang out in the hallway for a couple minutes until my time to get? How do we deal with documents? On and on and on. Okay, now let's let behavior be behavior.
well, not to be a mercenary weasel, but what was one of the first things we talked about at the beginning of this conversation? Think leadership first, location second. What is it as a leader that I should be doing? And then you figure out, how do I make it work in this environment? Right? With presentation, and you and I had the same approach to presentation skills. If you were in the classroom, what would you do? Well, I'd break them up into small groups. Well, there's breakout rooms. You can
Right.
do that. Right? I would stop and ask questions. So stop and ask a question. What's stopping you?
I know. Or how about
You
this
know,
one? Oh,
that's
what
the
if
first.
what if somebody asks a question that I don't want to answer, like about my competitor? I'm like, well, what would you do in person? You sit there and crumble in front of everybody. You figure out. You figure that's people. That's communication.
You know what it is. And this is why working virtually is slightly more complicated. And yes, I looked at the clock too. Uh, this is why working. Have you ever been driving late at night and it's pouring rain and you're trying to find an address, so you have to turn down the radio so you can see better?
Killer analogy. Yes.
What? Thank you. I've only been using that for 20 years. But think about this. You're trying to lead a meeting. You're trying to stay on topic, you're trying to reach the agenda, you're trying to facilitate the conversation, you're trying to include people, and oh, by the way, you've got to move the slides and read the chat and whatever. Your brain goes, too much for me.
Right.
I'm going to so I'm going to go through my presentation and not take questions because I don't want to get knocked off my timeline and I don't want to get distracted. Right? And there's lots of things you can do. You can get people to monitor the chat for you. You can have people run the whiteboard so that you don't have to think and spell at the same time, because nothing good happens when you have to do that. There's a lot of ways that you can do this, but it boils down to, what is the right thing to do in this circumstance? And then how do we make it work with what we got? And a lot of times we start with, here's what we've got, here are the constraints, before we think about what we want to accomplish. And whether that's meetings, whether that's trainings, whether that's how the team is going to function. Very often we start with the constraint rather than what we want to accomplish.
Right. Wayne, I think we could go another 4 hours and still be chuckling and dropping little nuggets of whatever. And I really appreciate all of the nuggets that you've dropped. Are there any questions that I should have asked you that I haven't?
How many copies of Long Distance Team should you buy for your work?
And if you order before midnight, you'll get the Ginsu.
If you order before midnight. Exactly. Wait, don't answer yet.
No, cut through a Volkswagen and still peel a tomato.
I think this has been a great conversation. I mean, Kevin and I started our business based on these conversations, right? Here's what's happening out in the world. What's really happening? What's changed? What are people doing about it? And how can we help them be more mindful about what they do about it? Right? That's the conversation. I mean, that's why you've been doing what you've done for so many years. It's why through my little evolution, I've done what I've done, because we're trying to help people have those conversations. And it's great. I mean, writing books is fabulous. But not everybody is going to read a book and go, oh, of course, there's the answer.
Right.
And so they need help and they need guidance and they have questions and like that. And so, shameless plug, the
no shame involved. Plug it.
Longdistanceteambook.com is the website just for the book. KevinEikenberry.com brings you to the Kevin Eikenberry Group, and you can find us there if we can be of assistance. Long Distance Team really just wraps up. We started with the leader, Long Distance Leader. Then we went to Long Distance Teammate, because there's the leader and then there's the individual. And now we're taking a look at forming the team so that the leader can be the leader and teammates can be great teammates. And this feels like it's kind of the right place to wrap up that cycle. So Thank you for the chance to talk about it, man. I appreciate it.
Well, you know what? One of the blessed things about maybe how the world has changed, and even kind of what brought about this particular Thought Leader Conversations series, was recognizing that one of the things that has changed, I began to see when I would be on a virtual stage with clients like GoTo, and we'd do a typical webinar where I'm teaching stuff, but we started, doing big events, and in person, I always hang out afterwards and just talk to people as long as people want to talk. And we started doing that virtually, and we were stunned at how many people would hang out. Well, parallel to that was the fact that, folks like Joe Rogan start blowing podcast ideas out of the water, right? And it's like, wait, what? He's doing 3-hour podcasts. What? Right? And it kind of it reintroduced long form content. And one of the things that evolved was the way people consume content, which was commonly sometimes, not always, sometimes put it on in the background, like when you had the radio playing. Right. And that's what people were doing when we would do extended Q&A at the end of a webinar, and people would hang out for another 15 or 30 minutes. And two different times we went for an hour, and we finally said, okay, now we got to go. That's kind of the genesis here. And one of the things that I hope is a takeaway for someone still listening to this is the fact that you can get decades of wisdom from Wayne and Kevin in a book for $20. And that has its place.
Yeah.
And going to, what was your website again for the book was?
Longdistanceteambook.com.
Longdistanceteambook.com is a different level of application. Right? Because it's one thing to read a book it's a different thing to have someone come in and have some dialogue. And so one of the things I really appreciate about this is just some of that application and little nuggets that have bubbled up just by virtue of the fact that you graced us, honored us with taking a little bit of time today.
Well, I don't know how much grace and honor is involved. I know that when we do this, right, people are listening, and part of the problem is people who are listening to this podcast are already in the percentage of people who care and actually want to be good at what they do, right?
Right.
So some of this is we're preaching to the choir, but there are three buckets when you listen to this or you read a book or whatever, right? There's the, yeah, we know this, we're already doing it. Good, right?
You want you're in the minority. I can tell you, you're in the minority.
You want reinforcement, but yes, some of that is true. And then there's, wow, that's totally brand new information. I never heard that before. You know, the driving the car in the rain analogy, right? I saw your little eyes light up. And there's some of that. Most of what you heard here and that you hear on podcasts and read in books, you know it on some level, but you've either forgotten it, or you didn't know what it was called, or you used to do it and you don't do it anymore and you know you should.
Can I add one to that? No.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Or someone else on your team needs to hear it. That's often why a specialist like Wayne or Kevin get brought in, is because that brings a different voice, a different level of authority or perceived authority, et cetera. So,
well, and you know this yourself because you've heard this every day of your professional life, the same as I have. Wow, this is great. My boss needs to hear this.
Right. Yeah. If I had a nickel for every time I heard that, yep, I'd be doing this from a yacht somewhere.
Talking to me, buddy.
Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time, Wayne. And longdistanceteambook.com.
Yep.
Longdistanceteambook.com. And we would look forward to having you back. Hope you get the next book out, and we'll
don't ever invite me to a party, man. I just might show up.
All right. With that, thank you, each and every one of you, for hanging out with us for a little bit on virtual venues.